I was just having a conversation online, a text conversation, with a good guy, he knows his name, and about the concept of when you learn something, you discover something, or you go through a period of change, personal growth, moral edification, for want of a better term, and you presume that it's a collective experience, a shared experience. It really rang true with me, and it reminded me of a phenomenon I noticed, which I tried to explain before but didn't do a good job of it, so I'm going to try and have another quick go of it. My job for a long time was to teach people how to do their jobs, particularly to explain to new recruits in this corporation all manner of things about how things worked, what they were supposed to do and why, what terminology meant and what certain concepts were. And I tried to put all these things in a correct order where one thing would build on another, where there was dependencies that would go in the right order, where I wouldn't explain one thing without having explained something else that was more foundational to that I wouldn't try to explain some aspect of the job or some process or method that didn't already rely on knowledge of some underlying smaller process or building block of the big series of skills and tasks that needed to come together to perform the overall job. So what I noticed in myself was that I actually felt embarrassed that I was teaching these people such obvious concepts and telling them things that, well, they must already know. And I presumed that just because I did. And yet I knew at the same time that I had spent a long time discovering these things, building up these skills through trial and error, confirming the knowledge through many years of making several mistakes and then learning what was the best methods and why they were the best methods, because if you didn't do it this way, something either could go wrong or would go wrong. Or there were different objectives that you might have, like which was the quickest way of doing something, which was the most permanent fix for something, which was the most reliable way of doing it, which was the most, well, you might say which was the cheapest way of doing it, but that wasn't so much of a concern. But there can be competing objectives, and so you should at least figure out what you're trying to prioritize. If there are several ways of doing something, well then, if it's not all just 6 of one, half a dozen of another, then you should decide which method to go for and why. And so all these things, when I was explaining these kind of rationales to people, as well as the concepts and the terminologies and what the words mean, and whether they meant something in normal, everyday English, or whether they meant something in a sort of proprietary version of that word, where it became like a term that meant something different once you're inside the walls of the institution. And it usually did. And there are a great many words that mean something different to a person outside of a corporation than they do inside. And not just because people are twisting words. But anyway, by the by, I'm getting off point here. It reminded me of the phenomenon that I was embarrassed to tell these people things, even though I was their teacher. And I felt like that they might be thinking, why is this guy telling us things that are so obvious? But of course they only seemed obvious to me because I knew them. And yet I was also aware that it had taken me a great many years to learn them. And then I thought, oh well, maybe I was just a slow learner. And maybe if I wasn't so stupid, I would have known them already. And so all these people are probably clever. And they're probably looking at me thinking, why is this guy so stupid as to think that he's telling us anything we don't know? Of course that wasn't the case. All of this actually seemed stupefying to them. It seemed overwhelming. It seemed like such a barrage of knowledge that they usually felt and said that they didn't think that they'd ever be able to understand it or put it to any practical use or remember it in order to be able to put it towards some purposeful, useful objective. But they did. Almost always they did, and they got some sense of it, some handle of it, and I knew that they would put their own twist on it, and I always tried to tell people exactly the right way to do it, because I knew they were going to cut corners off it anyway. But what I did notice very soon was that within a few weeks or months, certainly within a few years, these people acted as though they always knew these things. They had had some practical experience as well to back up what they'd been told originally. And I noticed that with new people, when I would ask them to explain to new people or to show new people what they were doing and why, that they would be surprised that these people didn't know already all the terminology, what to do, why to do it, and they had forgotten that there was a time that they ever didn't know. So the point here is to make the comparison to real life, our lives. I know one thing, that we're always terrified of appearing foolish. And we learn things and then we assume, oh, everybody must have known these already. I will try to make out that I always knew these things. Because otherwise, people might say, oh, you didn't know that? Wow, what a fool you must have been. What else do you not know? And I know people are terrified about revealing all the things they didn't know, because they're afraid people will then become aware of how foolish they are. So I hate to do this humble brag stuff again and say, like Socrates, who talked about how he had such a lack of knowledge, how he didn't know anything, how he was so ignorant. I mean, it was sort of a pretend act, but at the same time, it's the only position that is really valid. You have to err on the side of stupidity rather than err on the side of assuming you have intelligence. But more than that, a great assumption is to assume, a great false assumption is to assume that once you know something, oh, you must have always known it, and everybody else must know it too. That's the big thing. To assume that once you know it, there's no point in even explaining it or telling it to other people, because they already know it too, and why would they want it explained to them? And I'm not trying to say that I'm so considerate of others, but it makes me feel very presumptuous then to try to tell other people what I know, as though I'm assuming they don't know already. But certainly those that come after us, they need to be instructed. They need to be told. They can figure out things for themselves if they're allowed to, but they're always constantly discouraged from looking into things themselves. We know that there's a great many things us adults are literally forbidden from looking into, from questioning. So it's going to be difficult for anybody who suddenly finds themselves in the world, like I did once, like you all did once, and started asking questions. Where am I? Why is this that way? I mentioned before, like, why is the sky blue? Why do fish swim? Why is the grass green? And why do birds sing? We start out wanting to be orientated, or oriented, which is a funny word, but anyway, this was meant to be a quick one. It is up to us to pass on as best we can to others and to people that come after us. I would hope then that if we at least try to explain to others what we know, that it will be received in the spirit that it was given. Even if you know it already, it helps to hear it, I think, to know you weren't alone. Yes, I thought that too. I had that experience. So we do have a common experience here on earth. It's a wonderful feeling to become aware that somebody else has been going through some of the same experiences and the same thoughts. But equally, we can have a tendency to assume that when somebody is talking a bit more obliquely, a bit more in general terms, that what they're talking about is something that directly relates to an experience we had or a feeling that we had when we experienced something that may be similar. It probably instructs the person, it probably builds them up in the same way, it probably adds to their understanding and knowledge. It may not be exactly the same though. So we have to be prepared to allow for the fact that there may not be exactly shared experiences, but equivalent ones. But it's a very interesting thing to think about. And I think we should guard against always assuming that, now I'm at this particular level, let's say, not that it's a competition, of saying everybody else must be here. I think we must reach back and with generosity of spirit say to other people, okay, here's what I know. What, do you know this already? What do you know? Because everything seemed so certain when I was a child. And I think the more you know, the more you grow older and learn more things, the less certain everything seems to be. I used to not have any sympathy for anybody in that regard. Things were the way they were because everything was quite cut and dried, but not so much anymore. I wonder, does anybody else have some thoughts on that? I would be very interested to hear.